If you were born in January, you possess a certain characteristic that makes you one of the most special. The temperatures are at their absolute lowest, and natural sunlight is so incredibly scarce that you might think you started with a significant disadvantage. During the final trimester of pregnancy, with very little natural sunlight, your body relied more heavily on melatonin and brown fat, a specialized tissue that generates warmth and helps keep you feeling warm, while simultaneously burning energy much more efficiently. That is the first of the two benefits of being born in January: a greater tolerance to cold temperatures, a slightly more efficient basal metabolic rate, and a naturally leaner body type. However, the biology of winter does come with its own cost. Low levels of vitamin D in the mother during the final trimester, caused simply by a lack of sunlight exposure, are associated with a slightly increased risk of premature birth and low birth weight. Babies born in winter also tend to possess metabolic traits that make it easier for them to withstand periods of fasting or to go for longer stretches between meals without experiencing any problems. And this, back in the era of the caves, would have made you one of the most advantaged individuals. And then, in adulthood, individuals born in winter, and especially those born in January, face a slightly elevated risk of developing conditions such as high blood pressure, schizophrenia, and multiple sclerosis. It's nothing dramatic at all, just seasonal effects that most people never really hear about. And if it so happens that you were born in the southern hemisphere of the planet, there might be some slight variations with the specific months. But the fundamental principles of seasonality and environmental conditions are maintained to determine how they truly affect each individual. If you were born in February, you arrived right in the middle of the peak virus season, a blessing disguised as a disadvantage. That early exposure means it's more probable that you suffered from colds and respiratory problems throughout your first year of life. But the positive side is that this early exposure pushed your immune system to mature more rapidly and become significantly stronger than the average. You also tend to have more efficient fevers. They reach effective temperatures and eliminate infections more quickly. Your birth month also influences your potential for allergies. Infants who are born during the winter months, including February, have a higher likelihood of developing early adverse reactions to common food items such as cow's milk or eggs. On the other hand, babies delivered in the warmer seasons are more inclined to develop sensitivities to pollen. And even though it might seem like pseudoscience, these are actually patterns that depend primarily on what your immune system was exposed to during its very first days. The situation becomes a bit more complicated for those born in February. Like other individuals born in colder months, babies born in February face a slightly elevated risk of developing childhood asthma, in addition to an increased likelihood of developing type 1 diabetes. Researchers believe that this is also connected to the same early exposures to viruses that help strengthen your immune system. And it's quite interesting that February consistently has the lowest number of births throughout the year, even though conception rates actually see a significant increase right around February 14th. And if you were born on the 29th, you have one of the rarest birthdays on the entire planet. Some small studies indicate that individuals born in leap years tend to have a slightly longer life expectancy. March babies, however, gain even more advantages than the previous two groups. On the one hand, they gain something that the winter months simply don't provide: the return of bright sunlight right in the final stage of their prenatal development. That increase in light means your mother's vitamin D levels were rising during the third trimester, which is reflected in real physical differences. March babies, generally speaking, tend to be born a bit heavier, with improved bone mineralization and a slightly more developed lung capacity, all of which is linked to that late-stage vitamin D boost. What's more, there's an additional benefit that often goes unnoticed. Babies who are born in the early springtime usually remain for a slightly longer period inside the womb, in comparison to those conceived during the darker months. Just a few extra days of growth, which perfectly aligns with the higher birth weight observed in March. And these benefits do not end in childhood. Individuals born during the month of March exhibit a significantly lower risk of developing autoimmune conditions, as well as reduced blood pressure levels and notably lower rates of obesity throughout their adulthood. This is quite possibly due to the fact that vitamin D also greatly influences the way the human body effectively processes both fat and energy. Studies have also found that adults born in March tend to achieve higher scores on intellectual quotient tests and have a lower risk of suffering from attention deficit disorder. It is believed that this could be attributed to more stable maternal hormones during the late winter and the beginning of spring. If there is any small drawback, it is the same one observed in all winter births: a slightly higher risk of childhood asthma. But overall, being born in March places you right at the turning point of the year. Winter fades, light returns, and your biology reflects the first benefits of spring. April falls into a kind of perfect window for development. Your mother completed her pregnancy in a temperate climate, with stable temperatures and a decent amount of sunlight, neither frozen nor stifled by the heat, which keeps physiological stress low during the last trimester of pregnancy. When the environment is calmer, your physiology also tends to be. In multiple populations, babies born in April tend to have some of the most optimal birth weights, and their lungs also develop quite robustly. When vitamin D levels are decent and there are fewer infections in the final stretch of pregnancy, data shows lower rates of childhood asthma in some groups. And there's another advantage associated with this time of year. Babies conceived in the middle of summer and born at the beginning of spring are more likely to grow taller as adults and to enter puberty a little bit later. Adults born in April also show a greater resistance to stress and are a little more prone to complete higher levels of education. These are patterns researchers link to more optimal development in the womb. The only real downside is that being born just before the peak of pollen season means that as a young child, you're more likely to suffer from seasonal allergies, not due to pregnancy conditions, but because your first major environmental exposure happens right when allergens are at their peak. If you were born in May, congratulations. You arrived into an ideal environment for your development. By the time your mother reached her final trimester, sunlight was already constant. Her vitamin D levels were on the rise, and there were significantly fewer infections circulating. With fewer illnesses and a more stable physiology, your final stage of development took place under much better conditions than for many babies born in winter. As a result, babies born in May tend to have healthy birth weights, strong pulmonary function right from the start, and a more robust general development during their initial months of life. And the advantages don't stop there. Large-scale studies have found that May births are associated with the lowest risk of illnesses throughout their entire lives, fewer hospital visits for chronic diseases, and a 10 to 15% lower risk of developing heart conditions. This is likely due to more efficient cardiovascular development during that well-timed final trimester. The only minor drawback occurred during the pregnancy, not at birth. A large part of your mother's pregnancy coincided with winter, meaning she had to get through the cold and flu season without being able to take almost any medication beyond paracetamol. She risked getting sick so that you wouldn't. And honestly, you owe her one for that. Being born in June gives you an advantage that makes you function better than the rest. You see, there's something in the intensity of the sunlight in this month that deeply alters the way your body is programmed from the very first day. June babies are born with a biological clock that synchronizes with a much more stable light rhythm, resulting in more predictable sleep patterns and a naturally more balanced mood. And what's most surprising is that, as they grow older, they are less likely to develop depression or seasonal affective disorders, something that cannot be said for those born in the dead of winter. But that's not all. They also tend to have a higher birth weight, stronger bones, and even later puberty, which, according to some researchers, is linked to a childhood with fewer seasonal infections and more vitamin D. What's more, studies indicate that those born in early summer perform better in precision sports like golf or tennis. There is, however, one striking exception. Those born in June show a higher probability of developing myopia. It's still unknown why, but early exposure to light is believed to alter ocular development in unexpected ways. July. Imagine being born right in the middle of a scorching heat wave. Your tiny body, so fragile and just recently formed, gets its very first major lesson: how to survive the summer. And that's precisely what happens to all those babies who are born in July. Even before it took its very first breath, his body was already training under significant pressure. During the final weeks of the pregnancy, the mother's cardiovascular system has to work much harder to maintain her own body temperature. And this intense effort then pushes the baby to develop its own capacity to regulate its heat much earlier. The result, improved heat tolerance throughout their lives. and that small advantage later on really shows. Those born in July tend to perform better in outdoor endurance sports, like running or playing soccer under the sun. They even show slightly higher testosterone levels in adolescence, which could give them a physical edge. The disadvantage is they are more likely to develop skin cancer if they possess fair skin, and they have an increased risk of allergic reactions to summer fruits like melons and berries. Additionally, throughout their very first weeks, they are much more sensitive to dehydration. But if they pass that first test, they have something the rest don't. Summer is already incorporated into their DNA August. Just like in other summer months, babies born in August tend to weigh a little more, have stronger bones, reach puberty later, and become slightly taller adults. Summer, it appears, also leaves a distinct mark on our personality. But the story doesn't end there. That excessive sunlight also appears to influence the brain. Studies have found that individuals born in August tend to exhibit lower rates of depression and bipolar disorder. They also tend to be more optimistic, more outgoing, and even more active during the early hours of the day. Some researchers believe that everything is decided during the final trimester in the womb, precisely when the sun is most present. In fact, many of those born in August tend to identify themselves as morning people. And that also influences the way they live, how they perform, and how they interact with others. And there's something else. In countries like the United States, August is the month with the highest number of births each year, which means that, socially speaking, those born in this month often grow up surrounded by more people their own age, with greater opportunities to share experiences, play together, and connect with others. Even birthday parties usually have more guests. Being born in September gives you an initial advantage that many people don't even realize they have. Various studies have actually found a very unexpected pattern. People born in September are more likely to live past 100 years old. The reason? A healthier gestational environment during critical stages of their development. And there's more. Even in academic and professional fields, some studies, though more pronounced in certain countries, have observed that those born in September tend to achieve better results on early tests and have slightly higher incomes in adulthood. Not due to innate talent, but because of a series of cumulative factors that begin with biology. Does all this come at a cost? Very little. The most notable aspect is that if you're born close to the beginning of autumn, there's a higher exposure to environmental allergens. However, beyond that particular point, September presents one of the most robust profiles in the calendar: health, development, and longevity. October babies are made of different stuff. They are, on average, much stronger and healthier than most. Consistent research studies frequently demonstrate that individuals born in this period tend to exhibit a notably higher bone density, a significantly lower overall risk of developing various forms of cancer, and an approximately 10% reduced probability of experiencing cardiovascular diseases later in their adulthood. This is one of those intriguing patterns connected to the month of birth that scientists continue to discover repeatedly across various populations. There's also a psychological advantage that's rarely mentioned. Individuals born in October exhibit some of the lowest rates of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and suicide, with statistics showing them to be up to 17% below the yearly average. This particular combination positions October close to the very top in terms of longevity research, alongside September. As for physical performance, those born in October truly stand out in some quite unexpected areas. Children born this month tend to excel in tests of strength and coordination, hand grip, vertical jumps, and sprint speed. They are also disproportionately represented in sports such as hockey and American football. Nearly a quarter of all NHL players were born between October and December, reflecting that same pattern of an advantage in early physical development. And the drawbacks, they're almost entirely concentrated in the very first few years. October babies have a higher risk of developing childhood asthma and experiencing frequent respiratory infections during their infancy, since they are born right when the peak virus season starts. Most of these issues do resolve over time, but they can make the first few months of life a bit more challenging. Babies born in November often find themselves on the more resilient side of the health spectrum. They're also typically calmer infants, exhibiting fewer tantrums, possessing more composed temperaments, and are, in general, happier when contrasted with those born during the darker months of winter. From a physical perspective, November-born individuals also tend to be quite robust. People born this month have a 10 to 15% lower risk of heart disease or lung cancer. They also rank high in longevity studies, along with those born in September and October. Children born in November often perform exceptionally well in endurance sports and in activities that specifically target cardiovascular fitness. Youth data indicates they possess between 7 and 10% more aerobic capacity. And this significant advantage persists into adulthood. The best marathon runners are more likely to have their birthdays in the autumn months. And November is particularly well represented among long-distance athletes. However, what truly makes them distinct is their own biological clock. These individuals are more prone to becoming night owls, a characteristic that researchers associate with being born precisely when the days start to rapidly grow shorter. Those born in December often exhibit a superior tolerance to cold temperatures right from their early childhood, almost as if their physical bodies had been specifically calibrated to endure the harshness of winter. They also present a lower risk of certain major neurological disorders, including up to a 15% lower probability of developing multiple sclerosis. And when it comes to personality, they stand out for their balance. They are described as optimistic, constant individuals with a surprising ability to adapt. Unlike those born in November, who tend to be more nocturnal, you probably tend to be an early riser. And that, even though it might seem like a minor detail, makes it much easier to fit into school or work routines from an early age. But there's something quite a bit more curious. December has a unique cultural aspect. It's the only month where your birthday can go completely unnoticed. Between Christmas dinners, New Year's celebrations, and packed schedules, many born in December get used to, since childhood, their parties blending with all the others. Fewer individual gifts, less of the spotlight, but perhaps also more emotional resilience from an early age. And that contrast is what truly defines December, a closing month, yes, but for you it's the starting point. Don't forget to support this type of content by subscribing and watching this other very interesting video that you'll surely love.